Welcome to Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens, the podcast for moms and dads in the fight of their lives. I'm Brandon Jaffe, a licensed therapist and owner of Inspired Resolutions Counseling Center. For over 20 years, I've helped families face the chaos of defiance, addiction, anxiety, and despair. And I know how dark and lonely this road can feel. This podcast is about cutting through the noise. I'm here to weed out the unhealthy trends in modern mental health and get back to what actually works. Truth, clarity, boundaries, and connection. No fluff, no promises, just real help for real parents. So let's get to work. All right, welcome back to Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens. I, as always, am going to talk about something a little controversial today, and that is the concept of trauma. Like everybody, I get my algorithm brings me a lot of mental health stuff, and I've had a lot of conversations about trauma. I've treated a lot of patients with trauma. I've treated clients who come in who have been told that they have trauma and are unsure. And so just because of a lot of conversations that I've had lately, a lot of things that I've seen on social media, I want to bring some clarity to the concept of trauma. It is such an important concept, experience to talk about in mental health. It's something that we as therapists should be very adept at treating. However, it's become really confusing for, I think, pretty much everybody, including therapists and mental health professionals who are treating trauma. So I want to give you maybe a framework for being able to discern between trauma, experiencing adversity, experiencing something that's unfair or uncomfortable, and think that this is important, especially for families with children, because there is damage being done by mislabeling trauma. And there is damage being done because when we are trying to treat somebody for something that they don't have, or somebody's taking on the narrative or the what we call schema that they have experienced something that they haven't, there are relationships that get broken. There are behaviors that come about that are damaging and unhealthy. There are things that people maybe take responsibility for that they shouldn't. There are things that people don't take responsibility for that they should. And so I want to unpack that. I don't want to offend anybody, but my hope is that by beginning this conversation, maybe at least one or two of you out there might find a better direction for healing. I want to start with an observation, a clinical observation I've had over the last over 2 decades of treating people. And that's that most of the time, I'm not saying every time, but most of the time that I've worked with a client who has truly experienced either a traumatic event or persistent abuse that is traumatic, when they've truly experienced trauma, they don't want to be labeled as having experienced trauma. They don't come in with that label of I've experienced trauma. In fact, often, if not usually, it is hard to get them to talk about the trauma. They kind of dance around it. They don't want to label it. They don't want this stamp on their forehead of being a traumatized person. Not too long ago, I was working with a woman who had experienced abuse in ways that are pretty horrific and in multiple relationships, actually. And it was interesting because the wrestle of getting her to not admit, voice that she had experienced trauma, something that was affecting her dreams, it was affecting her ability to function at times in her life. It was such a wrestle in session. And I can remember thinking, oh my gosh, for her to admit that she has experienced trauma might be some sort of re-traumatizing experience for her. And it wasn't, but it's not always that difficult. But this woman did not. She was determined to build an identity outside of her trauma. And that's a really good place to help somebody to get to when they have experienced trauma. We don't want that experience or those experiences to become somebody's identity, but we have to help them be honest that what they experienced was not just adversity. It wasn't just something that was really, really uncomfortable or unfair or mean. What they experienced was trauma, and it can be an accident, it can be war, it can be an abusive relationship. It was interesting because as I worked with this woman, she wanted to breeze past the trauma work, and slowing her down was kind of difficult. But again, there was this freedom in being able to finally get herself to admit that she had experienced trauma, number one. Number two, that persistence, that decision, that moment she made a decision that it was not going to be her identity, there was this shift in just how she pursued healing. I'm not sure how to frame this because it's not, I don't want to say every single person, okay? I'm definitely talking in generalities right now, but often, if not most of the time, people who have experienced trauma, they're running away. They want to get away from that trauma. There might be all these unhealthy things going on where they repeat patterns and they can't get away from it, but they don't, I don't even know how to explain it. It's almost like they come into therapy and they don't lead with the trauma. That's unless they're in the middle of unpacking it because they're switching therapists or going through a transition, they don't come in and lead with that trauma often. And again, I can't put my finger on how to explain it, but on the other side of it, I will have clients who definitely need help, but will come in with every adverse experience or the most current adverse experiences or uncomfortable experiences that they have been going through, and they're insistent on calling it trauma. Now, I'm not saying that those people have never experienced trauma, but often that posture, I guess I could call it, is a sign that it's time for some discernment in the therapy room when it comes to labeling trauma. Let me give you an example of that. I worked with this client. He came into the room. He had been to several therapists before me, as is often the case. And he came in being very clear about what he wanted to work on. He said, I've experienced so much trauma in my life that it's hard, if not impossible, for me to get motivated. I can't function in school. I can't do what my parents want. It was very interesting because he talked about how these other therapists had given him various diagnoses and had very much either, I don't know, supported, encouraged, backed up this idea that he had experienced significant traumas in his life. And so I try to take a curious standpoint when I'm with my clients, especially if I don't know them, and I don't make assumptions. And so when somebody tells me that they've experienced trauma, one of the first questions I ask is, help me understand what the trauma was. Now, here's the issue with this client. They had a really hard time answering that question directly. And it wasn't because they were reliving some trauma that they didn't want to talk about. They didn't have specific moments where they had experienced trauma, but they had descriptions. And so instead, they went on to describe critical parents, friendships that went really poorly, a series of rejections. They went on to describe a series of events from childhood till now that seemed unfair, that sucked. The experience of being mean, maybe some, I don't know, and their parents were maybe a little bit rigid, but there were no major car accidents. There was no life or death situations. There was no persistent abuse or abuse of any kind. They were a series of uncomfortable situations. There wasn't bullying that went on and on and on. Some of the situations were, a bummer, but there wasn't any description of actual trauma. And I know there can be a gray area. I don't want to pretend like there's this strict line, this is trauma and this is not. But there are some things on one end and the other that definitely are not trauma. So with this client, one thing that stood out to me is there was almost this pride in having been the victim of trauma, of having that trauma label. And being the style, the type of therapist that I am, I challenged that. I gave that observation back to this client. I described that they had been bringing that up often. And for some reason, I was getting a sense that there was some pride in it. And I didn't want to sound judgmental. I let them know there might be some pride in it, but I wanted them to help me understand why I might be experiencing them that way. I can even remember pointing out that we spent a lot of time it was describing that they had experienced trauma rather than discussing steps towards healing. And because I knew they had experienced so much therapy in the past, I asked them how long they had been working on this trauma. And I asked them to kind of tell me how much healing had been done from this trauma. And they in essence said nothing. Nothing had ever worked. And so I presented to them something that no other therapist yet had presented to this person. And I said, is there a chance that you are using the label of trauma as a shield, as maybe a subconscious way to comfortable instead of exploring things that are unknown? Is there a chance that labeling what's going on with you as being a result of trauma hasn't worked because it's not? I pointed out to them that they had done trauma work with so many therapists and it wasn't working, that no progress had been made, that it might be time to have a different discussion. It was interesting because I think that they were ready to change because they didn't fight me on it. And in fact, they really nodded affirmatively. And so this is where I'm going to be blunt. Okay. Any therapist who validates everything as being trauma because the client wants to label it as trauma is doing damage. You're doing damage. You're wasting their time. You're wasting their money. We as therapists should be able to have a good discernment about what is trauma and what is not trauma. Again, there might be some gray areas, but I'm going to be honest. I haven't run into significantly gray areas. It's pretty obvious usually when somebody's experienced a traumatic event or a lifetime of trauma. And it's kind of obvious when somebody's just experienced adversity. It looks different. Okay. It's hard for me to say that because I know I'm going to be judged, but when you encourage people to be fragile,
Family life doesn't come with a manual, but it should come with the brief. I'm Mike Cater, family and matrimonial lawyer. And on the brief, I tackle the questions and concerns that keep families up at night. Everything from custody battles and co-parenting to managing finances, mental health, and more. With years in the courtroom, I've seen it all. And I'm here to share lessons, strategies, and stories that can help you navigate the toughest situations. Whether you're a parent, partner, or just someone who wants to expand your knowledge, join me each week on The Brief. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts, and let's find solutions together.
You are not helping them. You can encourage resilience in somebody and acknowledge that they've experienced difficult things. You see, trauma is not the end-all be-all. Difficult, mean experiences, adversity, things that were uncomfortable, those leave a mark. I don't want to deny that. I think that we should talk about those things with the family in therapy. I think that those can be addressed. Just not everything has to be difficult, should be labeled as trauma because the discussions are different. With trauma work, while there's a responsibility you have to take for your mental health, you are not taking accountability for the abuse or the event that happened that wasn't in your control. And when you're working with somebody who's just experienced a lot of difficult things or difficult relationships, a lot of times the work you're doing is helping them see that there's a significant amount of control that they have moving forward. There are behaviors, there are postures, there are tones, there are decisions, there are attitudes that if they take responsibility for it, there are maybe other mental health issues that they can address and not, well, sometimes fix, work on, improve, grow at, so that the difficult experiences in their life either reduce or they become something that they're able to cope with. And that's the other thing. You don't teach somebody who's experiencing trauma because of abuse to cope with it. You help them get safe. But if somebody has a rigid parent, you don't want them cutting off that parent just because they think that that parent has caused them trauma. No, you just have a pain in the butt parent, and we want you to love that parent. We want you to learn to navigate that loving parent who maybe is making some mistakes. But if you're a child who's experiencing trauma because of abuse, I want you to figure out a way, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure that you get safe. And so, again, the treatment is just so different. And so, again, I think this discernment is so important for all of us, therapists, parents, everybody in society, to do a better job at. And so I remember I was working with this teenager. He was quite the athlete. He had so many opportunities. He had a rough life, man. Some pretty terrible things happened to him. And so he had gotten far with his soccer team, and he had gone, I don't think it was high school. I think it was one of these travel teams, and he didn't have parents to go with, right? And there's all these other parents, and this team had worked hard, and they had gone through, spending a lot of money getting everybody there. I think he was on some sort of grant, but the thing was they lost, and there were some other experiences along the way that were terrible. And one of the parents was kind of co-signing with one of his friends that this loss was somehow traumatic because of all the work that they had put in, and it was unfair, something. I don't remember the specifics, but I remember somehow this client was faced with hearing this parent and this teenager talk about how traumatic this loss was. And that really confused, angered, it's all the feelings for my client, because he had been through trauma. And so he didn't want to bring it into therapy. I can't even remember how we came to even talk about it, because he wasn't somebody who would normally bring something like this in. But nevertheless, what he essentially told me is, if that is trauma, then what did I go through? And how can I ever heal from what I went through if that's trauma? And so it was this combination of confusion. He was right in the middle of doing so much good work. And all of a sudden he's realizing that, well, not realizing, he's experiencing people call something traumatic that's not traumatic, and he's left feeling totally minimized. Now, he never talked to these people. Nobody knew that he was going through this. But that's a very clear-cut example of why it can be dangerous, unfair, and damaging to somebody who's actually experienced trauma. I think it's damaging to people who haven't experienced it and are calling it that. But in this case, this poor guy became really confused. He became kind of resentful, and luckily he was able to process it. We were able to talk about the trend, and it angered him, the trend of calling everything traumatic. And so earlier I began talking about this, but it is so misleading and unproductive. If you are experiencing adversity, experiencing something that's adverse, that's really just difficult and uncomfortable. If you call that trauma and you begin trauma work, you are missing a huge piece of what therapy should be doing for you. And that piece is that you should be learning resilience. You should be learning ways to sometimes you got to grieve things that are difficult and unfair in your life. There's all these steps. Tolerance. You should be learning tolerance. You should be learning to take accountability, setting boundaries. And, so there's all these steps that you're going to miss if you label something traumatic that isn't actually traumatic. And again, we as therapists, I think, have a responsibility for changing this conversation, changing this trend now. Now, not just with the client I was mentioning earlier, but I've had several clients where I challenged this concept of trauma that they were carrying around, and they get angry. It doesn't look pretty. They don't like it. They don't walk out going, "Oh, I'm so thankful, Brandon, that you have opened my eyes to this." They often will respond with me, "You don't understand. You're just like everybody else who's just dismissing mental health." And I get it. I totally get it. And I'm very careful. I don't just go off the cuff and confront clients with this. Every client that's talking about it, I have to be pretty sure, and I gather a lot of information, but often the response is this big wrestle in therapy. And that wrestle, as uncomfortable as it is for me, as uncomfortable as it is for the client, it is so therapeutic, so important. Allowing them to be angry at me, and even I've had them voice, "I'm going to fire you. You clearly aren't a good therapist. I don't want to work with you." But often, usually, when after that wrestle happens, there's this shift that happens, this freedom. They begin to slowly be able to take accountability when they see that we can both acknowledge and hold as important the difficult circumstances in their life without calling it trauma, that there are ways to take accountability, that there are ways to let go of the things that you can't control. What happens is they slowly sink into this almost freedom, this, I don't know, they break free of needing to be a victim. It's like this confidence, this self-esteem kind of slingshots them ahead as they take more and more accountability. And again, it's not that they're responsible for every bad thing that they're experiencing. It's just that because they aren't coming from I'm a victim of trauma standpoint, it's just, I've got some really difficult things going on in my life. There's this shift. And I can remember this one client towards the end of treatment telling me, "I don't know why I kept working with you. You were the most insulting and, I thought at the time, minimizing, mean therapist. And I really just kept coming back to you because I was absolutely baffled that a therapist would not understand what I had been through. But now I realize you're the only person I ever worked with who had the guts to stand up to me." And that was a really interesting conversation because I remember thinking, "Oh no, this client's not coming back." And I remember being astonished that they had kept coming back. And I think that's a key. I think that says something. Subconsciously, they knew, right? They kept coming back because they weren't ready to face life on life's terms yet, but they wanted help getting there. And it was such an honor to work with this client. And they did need help. They belonged in the therapy room. They just didn't belong with the label of having been a trauma victim. And so that client, man, that stands out to me. That was a wild ride for me and for them. But it was worth the confrontation. It was worth the wrestle. I want to give you some more practical applications. I want to give you a little bit of a framework to work from, right? Here's the three categories, right? Trauma. Trauma is life-threatening, safety-shattering stuff. It's abuse, assault, war. It is sudden, violent loss, accidents. Here's the thing. Traumatic events, they overwhelm the nervous system and they change the way that you experience the world. Now, not everything that is traumatic for one person ends up being traumatic for another person, but there is a central nervous system override that takes place. So you can't fake it, right? And it, again, that life-changing, it is life-changing. Your worldview changes significantly. And in that, as a therapist, it is my job to be able to assess whether or not that has happened. Now, adversity it might be a tough season of life, divorce, rejection, criticism, job loss, being misunderstood severely. Look, these things hurt, but they are survivable. Okay. And it's interesting because with some perspective and a little bit of work and talk, and they can turn into opportunities for resilience really quickly. Not that going through trauma doesn't become, when you overcome trauma, you are stronger, you are better, you have grown. But when you experience adversity, that process is quick if you choose it to be. And experiencing adversity over and over again and overcoming it with healthy mindset, it makes you stronger a little bit at a time. It's a positive thing, oddly enough. We all need to experience adversity. We don't all need to experience trauma. So now, feeling discomfort. That is the ordinary frustrations of being human, okay? If people who are annoying, experiencing bad grades, breakups, sitting in traffic, not getting what you want when you want it. Look, discomfort is not trauma, and it doesn't even need to be labeled as adversity. A lot of times the things that we're annoyed by, that we're uncomfortable with, a lot of those things, we make a decision. We can make the decision to have a happier mindset. We can make the decision really quickly to be more tolerant. We have more control over this section. And so what's interesting is developing the ability to either deal with discomfort or stop experiencing things as uncomfortable, right? Embracing things that were uncomfortable but now aren't for you. That is life. That is an important piece to your maturity. People who don't experience uncomfortable things are not going to become mature. Sorry. You cannot be the man or woman that you want to be without it. And so that's the framework I give people. So here's a few takeaways. Number one, it is not kind to label everything as trauma. That isn't helping anybody, even if you think that it is. It's not kind to let somebody stay stuck in victimhood and fragility if they don't belong there, if they're not a victim. It is kind to confront them in a loving way. It is kind to let them know the truth, even if it creates a really uncomfortable situation for you and them. Trauma, okay, the next takeaway is trauma is real. It produces some deep, deep emotional scars. Not every scar is trauma, though. A lot of the scars we experience are just reminders that life can be hard, but life is worth pushing forward and growing in. So the next time that you or a loved one is discussing trauma, I want you to pause. I want you to ask yourself, is this truly trauma? Is this adversity? Is this just something that's uncomfortable? And that clarity is important. That clarity will lead to healing in all three areas. It will lead to growth in all three areas. And so I appreciate you bearing with me. I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I hope that I've helped at least one person out there. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens. If you found this episode helpful, please like, follow, and share it with someone who needs it. For more support and resources, you can visit us at inspiredresolutionscounseling.com. Remember, you are not alone.